Okay, so we're talking about the evolution of the Constitution, how it came to be, what prompted it, what started it, how did it get started. And basically, what's happening is now that the United States has its independence from Great Britain, they have to form a nation. Or are they even going to be a nation? Are they going to be 13 individual states? And the first attempt was the Articles of Confederation, which was started during the Revolutionary War. It was the first attempt at a national government, and it was a very loose union. It wasn't the states were not very tightly bound together. Each state retained kind of its own independence from the other one, and as a result, the Congress had very little power. They couldn't tax. They had no power to regulate trade. There was no common currency, no common system of measurements, nothing like that. There was no executive. Nobody had executive power under the Articles of Confederation. There was no president, there was no chief executive, nobody to carry out the law or enforce the law, which is what the job of an executive is. There was also no judicial branch, and the job of the judicial branch is to interpret the laws or to resolve disputes between the states, resolve disputes between individuals. You didn't have that. There was also no common currency, no common trade, and no common foreign policy rules. So if Georgia wanted to form an alliance with Spain and South Carolina wanted to form an alliance with England, I mean, they would have been perfectly fine to do that under the Articles of Confederation. And that causes problems, and it leads to conflict. And Great Britain and France and Spain were all three just kind of licking their chops, waiting on the United States to implode so they could come in and retake that territory. Now, the government under the Articles was not without accomplishment. They did win the Revolutionary War, and that is a big accomplishment. And they passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Basically, what that means is they convinced the states to give up their land claims in the West that were Indian land, basically. They convinced them to give up those settlements or to give up those claims so that white settlers could move into that land and take it from the Indians. Now, the thing that prompted a change in the Articles of Confederation was something called Shays' Rebellion. This was an armed rebellion. Massachusetts had a very unfair tax system set up that favored the merchants in the East. Well, the farmers in the western part of Massachusetts were losing their farms, so they couldn't pay their taxes. They're losing their farms. And a Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays led an armed rebellion. And there wasn't really anybody to put it down except the Massachusetts militia, which finally did put it down after several months. And this exposed a lot of the weaknesses. How are we going to deal with an armed rebellion like that? How are we going to deal? What if it wasn't an armed rebellion from within the United States? What if Spain attacked? What if France attacked? Or what if Britain attacked again? Or what would happen if there was a massive Indian attack against the United States? How would they respond? How would they be able to function? And this led a lot of people to meet in Philadelphia in 1787 to try to revise the Articles of Confederation. And it quickly became apparent that the Articles were beyond fixing. You could not make them work. And you could not make them do what the nation needed it to do. So they decided to just completely scrap the Articles of Confederation and go with a complete overhaul, a whole new constitution. And what they got was several controversies. The first controversy was over the legislature. Who was going to pass the laws and how were those states going to be represented? Well, the big states like Virginia wanted representation based on population. The majority has certain rights as the majority. But the smaller states wanted all the states to be equal, have an equal number of representatives, because if it's all done by population, then the little guys are going to get trampled on all the time. They want the rights of the minority protected. So, how can you fix this? How can you satisfy the big states who want representation based on population, and satisfy the small states who want to be protected from the big states? And the solution was a two-house legislature. You had an upper house called the Senate, and there would be 2 senators from each state. Now, originally the senators were appointed by the state legislatures. Eventually, in 1916, they changed that to where you can actually elect senators now. We elect senators today. The lower house, which was called the House of Representatives, these were the ones voted on directly by the people, and the number of representatives was based on each state's population. So the larger your state's population, the more representatives you'll have. And that satisfied the bigger states. Now, the second controversy, if you're going to be counting population, remember in the South you've got a fairly sizable slave population. And as we said before, slavery was kind of on the way out in the North. It wasn't really practical, it wasn't really profitable, but in the South, people held on to slavery. It was still on the way out because, you know, you couldn't have large-scale agriculture yet in some of the places in the South, but you still had a sizable slave population. And of course, the South, which had a smaller population than the North, wanted slaves to count towards population. You know, one slave, one person. The northern states felt that that wasn't exactly fair. A small minority of people in the North felt that slavery shouldn't even be around. We shouldn't even have slavery. How can we have a free society and call ourselves free when we have slaves? But the more mainline Northerners said that, well, if it's property, if slaves are property, they shouldn't count any more than any other type of property should count towards population. You know, it gave the South kind of an unfair advantage. So what they came up with was something called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And for the purposes of representation, you know, population counts towards representation, they said that 3/5 of what they called all other persons, and it was implied, of course, that this meant enslaved African Americans, would count towards the total population. So basically, your total population could be expressed as an equation of total population would equal free population plus 3/5 of the total population of enslaved people. So if your free population was 90, if you had free people, if you had 90 free people in an area, and you had those 90 people owned 100 slaves, then the total population would be 90 plus 60, which is 3/5 of 100, which gives you a population of 150. You know, when again, the slaves had no rights. They had no legal rights under the law. They couldn't vote. So really, who was really being represented was a small minority of people, and that gave the South kind of a bloated representation. And it's especially going to get bad when the slavery expands and slavery becomes a bigger deal in the South than it was even then. All right, another controversy you had was something called the Bill of Rights. And the Anti-Federalists, which were people that were kind of opposed to the idea of a strong national government, they were concerned because the original draft of the Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights. Remember, a Bill of Rights is a list of freedoms that the government promises to protect. And the original draft of the Constitution did not have that. So the solution to that was one of your leading Federalists, people that supported the Constitution, the primary author of the Constitution, actually, James Madison, and one of the leading Anti-Federalists, a guy named George Mason from Virginia, drew up 10 amendments or additions that became known as the Bill of Rights. And these do things like protect personal liberties. We'll get into this a little bit more next week. They protect personal liberties, prevent abuse of power, protect the rights of the accused, and they leave the Constitution open for some interpretation.